we have a lot of creativity in the continent. We have a lot of people who just have like mind-blowing ideas.
Meet Wakiuru Njuguna, the managing partner of HEVA Fund, Africa's first investments, advisory and knowledge solutions hub for the creative industries.
Creatives in Africa, in your opinion, what do they struggle with?
So
Wakiuru,
yes.
What's your answer to people asking you, what do you do?
That's a good question. It's a really good way to start. So I always say I work in finance, but in the creative sector. And I think primarily because you find a lot of people who say they work in the creative space are either artists. They have like a production, direct production aspect to it. But then on my end, it's facilitating access to finance for the creative industries. So whether it's, thinking through what models work for the creative sector, experimenting on, which models are best for, the different value chains and the different industries within the creative economy, and thinking through how to, I guess, move capital from, from one end to the creative space. Yeah, so that's essentially my work.
Yeah, and what I'm understanding is you come from a finance background.
Yeah.
So maybe could you walk us through a summarized version of your journey of how you got here?
Yeah, that's interesting. My background is in finance, but actually before coming into HEVA, I was working in a production company called the Nest Collective. Actually, the Nest Collective is a sister company to HEVA Fund. Essentially, I was in finance and accounts, and so when we were shooting movies, and doing all that kind of like cool stuff, I was the person on the back end trying to figure out what budgets would make sense and what costs we needed to cut, etc. And I did that for I want to say about 2 years. But then within the same 2 years, we were also at the intersection of now starting to think through what is a bigger picture for creatives and entrepreneurs within the creative space, and especially from a finance perspective, where are the gaps? And because we also experienced those gaps, where we had several productions that needed financing, we could only get grants, but then even the grants came with so many limitations, and some of the productions did really, really well. So thinking through the commercial aspect of creative industries was something that we had started to experience internally, and then realized that it wasn't just the collective that was going through these challenges, it was the wider ecosystem. At the time, there was also quite a shift in finance, and a lot of the businesses or the entrepreneurs we were interacting with were really struggling to just even go to the bank and kind of like get a facility to produce and then sell. Majority of the capital available was mostly grants, and even the grants were, like I said, they were very limiting. They were also quite there were not many institutions that were giving grants, so getting a grant was like quite a difficult process. And so those conversations were happening internally. So I was kind of like shooting films during the day, and then on the side also thinking through what would a wider ecosystem bridging the gap of finance look like. And that was really cool because the insights we got from the experiences we had doing actual production were kind of like what made HEVA, what just gave us like the map of what HEVA would be doing going forward.
Why does this industry interest you? What about it makes you excited and, have such a long career specifically in the creative industry?
I guess one of the things that's really exciting for me for, when we look at the creatives, and even when I came into the creative space, was just the fact that it was so different. There was so much innovation. There were so many cool things happening. People literally just living through their passions and actualizing what was in their brains and, bringing it to life. For me, that's really exciting. And I think a lot of people are not able to navigate this space because of the challenges of access, for example, or even if they produce and they start doing some things, they're not able to do it at the scale they envision it would be. And so I guess it was a challenge. I love challenges, one, but I also really enjoy doing things that are outside of the ordinary, because I would probably have sat in maybe a financial institution and done the same thing over and over again. But the idea of now bringing even a creative way to thinking about finance, because when you have to finance the creative industry, I don't think in our experience, you do not use the same lens. There's a lot of unlearning and there's a lot of learning that comes into play. And I think it's that kind of like mind shifting, those experiences for me that were pretty exciting. And I was like, we have to figure this out. And I guess at that time, nobody had really kind of like tried to crack it. I want to say we are the first in the continent actually to primarily focus on the creative industries. And so there are so many things that were not tested or tried that we've had to kind of like, wing it and do and learn as we go. And for me, that's exciting. And also just looking at what happens when you actually trust and invest in an entrepreneur, a creative entrepreneur or an artist, the scale of impact that could have, not just from a commercial perspective, which is important, but then also from a cultural expression, perspective. I think that's really cool. So I guess the alternative was for me to do the mundane finance work, and I was like, no, I needed something challenging. And I guess I'm still here because it's still challenging and we're still learning new things and we're still experimenting.
Yeah, it sounds like sitting behind a desk and essentially pushing numbers wasn't meant for you. And I also heard you described a lot about the problem that HEVA is solving and the mission that you guys are on. But before we actually go a bit more into that, how you guys are solving the problem, could you kindly walk us through what is the creative industry and what type of businesses and individuals would fall under this industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's so broad, but generally, when you think about the creative industry, it's the sectors that are involved in the production. I think it's a production. I had actually written it down because I had a feeling you were going to ask me this. Production and distribution of either goods or services. And in this case, it could be like tech products, it could be like your traditional artifacts, fashion, etc. And experiences as well, because now we're seeing a lot of people enjoying experiences that value either creativity or culture. So there's a direct linkage of the products and services to creativity and culture, and also intellectual property, because that's the thing that the creative industry is able to produce, especially from a service perspective. So it's any business along the value chain, whether on the production and even going all the way to raw materials. So like, for example, farming of cotton, which then goes into the production of the fabrics, etc., then goes into, I guess, into a fashion designer's lookbook, and they're like, okay, we're going to use this fabric because of XYZ. And then you think about now the distribution and access to market channels. So there's a retail front, which is your typical traditional retail shops. There's now e-commerce platforms that are powering, businesses to be able to access bigger businesses. And even along that value chain, there's solutions. There's like tech solutions that are able to amplify or solve very specific challenges, whether it's in sizing. I'm giving the example of fashion because it's, yeah. So even if it's, figuring out sizing for the African continent, for example, or AI around, people being able to try on new products and new designs. So the value chain is quite wide, but also there's several things that come into play when you're thinking about the creative industries. Again, there's also the marketing. So there's advertising, which also comes into kind of like that same loop, all the way to how the products get to the end user. And in the current discussion around sustainability, there's also other things post the customer purchasing the designs or the clothes, which is what sustainability solutions are being created for the fashion industry, for example. So just in a nutshell, it's kind of like along thinking through the from the beginning, which is production, all the way to distribution and access to market. Yeah.
Yes, and what I'm also understanding is, like you said, it's quite broad. From, you talk about someone who has a fashion design business or a retail business, and it could even be like someone who perhaps wants to get into music, on the production side of things, maybe theater, acting. So it is quite broad. And from a challenge point of view, creatives in Africa, in your opinion, what do they struggle with, and what have they been, what was the biggest challenges compared to, other regions in first world countries?
Yeah, and I don't know. So just to give the context of the local, or rather the continent, I think, and even in our experience from very early on, the issue has never been the creativity. We have a lot of creativity in the continent. We have a lot of people who are just have mind-blowing ideas. The issue has always been the infrastructure around the creative sector. And by infrastructure, it's not just like the physical spaces. So that is one of the things, the physical spaces that allow people to test and experiment and, get to kind of like a minimum viable product and then launch. So that does not really exist. But then also you look at the policies around the creative space. I think only a few countries in the continent have quite forward-thinking policies around taxation, around rebates, around support for creative entrepreneurs. And I think South Africa is one of them. But, in most markets, you find that the creative has to figure out everything themselves. So they have to figure out, one, they have this amazing idea. They have to figure out the production side because they are probably, I think in this age of tech and YouTube and everything, it's a little bit easier. But again, also access to internet is also a factor to consider. But in most cases, even in terms of educational institutions, they're not really up to date as to what they're teaching around the creative kind of technical skills. Then you find the market, or rather the environment in which they have to now produce, either is quite limiting in terms of how much it costs to produce locally. And I mean this even for music and other kind of non physical product businesses within the creative sector. Even access to studios, for example, in some spaces is quite a challenge even up to now. And even access to equipment. And so you find whoever is able to flourish either has really kind of innovated around other ways they can get things done, or they have jumped so many hoops to get to the point where they're actually producing something. There is the access to finance, which is another challenge. There is access to markets. And I think we look at sometimes at successful maybe businesses that have made it as those ones that are able to export to other markets. But I think also just looking at local markets, how do businesses access local markets? Are there spaces for performance? Are there spaces for events? And even when you, again, the infrastructure around it, because the spaces also have to be like safe spaces for the people who are coming to the event. So there's so many things that come to play. And oftentimes the creative needs to figure out so many things before they actually get to the point where they're able to produce and successfully distribute their work and their output. Now, you asked a very interesting question. What have other markets, or what has been successful in other spaces?
First world countries, yeah.
In other countries, I think infrastructure is the first thing that really kind of like changes the trajectory of how whether creative businesses are going to be successful or not. And if you look at regions like in Europe, where they have all these government-led funds that support young artists, and I think even South Africa actually has a lot of government-led access to finance opportunities for young people and for artists as well. If you look at mobility as well, within the EU, for example, which allows artists to move from one place to the next in quite a very easily, that also comes into play, because if you're able to perform in the morning, in one country, and then move very quickly to another country or to another city, it broadens your range of audiences that you're able to target. And so it's all the things, and I'd say actually the government is quite a major factor here, because without the policies that are conducive for the creative space, then even private investors will be shy or will look at it as a very risky space to come in, because they also have to figure out everything. And I think this is a good segue into what HEVA does, because we realized very early on that we couldn't just do access to finance. We had to start thinking through how to influence policy, or how to use advocacy to change things within the creative space. And so that meant, going into research and generating data to be able to support, so kind of like evidence-based advocacy. And then we also quickly realized that outside of that, we needed to figure out how to support the entrepreneur, so business development services, not just with the business skills, but then also with the technical skills, because we met quite a large group of creatives who had learned everything on YouTube, which was really interesting. But then, now I think things are a little bit easier, but still they're still underserved communities that still don't have the same access.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges that you mentioned, and what I picked up from that, the first being from the creative themselves, a skills and upskilling. That's definitely number one. Of course, number two, you mentioned infrastructure, which perhaps affects distribution, all the way from the beginning of the value chain to the end. And then, of course, the third being finance and access to, sufficient and readily available finance, specifically maybe from governments or other organizations. Going into HEVA, how have you guys been able to firstly acquire funding, and then the process of then deploying capital towards the creatives themselves? Could you walk me through that, the funding landscape?
Yeah. So again, the funding landscape, especially when we started, because HEVA was started in 2014, and it was really difficult to fundraise, especially for the creative space. I think things now, you'll find there's a bit more discourse around the creative sector, especially from a finance perspective, because suddenly the youth boom in the continent is clear as light as and day, that we are going to have the largest percentage of young people in the continent. And so now, thinking through how to target those young people is a major focus. But in terms of like our process, the process that we've gone through to raise financing, I guess we had to first of all make a case for it. And like I said, we had a collective that had already been involved in production of artistic work. We had some incomes from some of the things that we had produced, some of them being films, others being, publishing books, and the likes. And so we said, okay, let's test this internally. Let's see what this could mean. What we did initially was we gave grants to 10 artists. And they said, okay, we said, let's see what happens if we give a grant and what that means to kind of like what economic model would come out of that from the creative businesses. And we saw artists kind of like take their product to market. So they were able to produce a certain number of products, take them to market, and then, have a way to target and attract their audiences. And people came and sold and etc. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. But then that was it. Because then we're like, okay, so we've given out the grants. We no longer have, there's no money coming back. So we now have to go back to the drawing board of where to get more money. Those experiences for us were particularly interesting, but we decided to first do a feasibility study to see, is this something that was just unique to Kenya, or would you find kind of like the same challenges across the board? So we went to Uganda, Tanzania, I think Rwanda, and so the challenges were actually the characteristics of the creative sector was the same across East Africa. The challenges were the same. In some instances, markets like Kenya were a little bit more advanced, but the core challenges remained the same. And so that's how we then said, okay, so we're going to target, specific types of institutions to raise money from. I think we were very clear from the beginning that we wanted to experiment because it had never been done before. And so we approached one of our existing partners, and they were quite excited at this idea of building economic models around, creative businesses and artists. And we again had like our first cohort of, and remember the experience I told you where we gave out money and nothing came back? We're very clear that for this to work, we had to have a sustainability angle. And so the sustainability bit was only if we were able to recoup back the capital. And then now start to accumulate, capital that would then go into like a revolving fund that would fund more creatives. So we said, we got a cohort of about 15 companies, and we invested, we gave them debt facilities. We learned so much along the way, especially around the nuances when it comes to capital, and how to target and how to build products, financial services and products specifically for creative businesses. And that an investment in a fashion company would not be the same as an investment in a film company or a music company. And so that money allowed us to test different models, from revenue shares to to thinking through how to share royalties, revenue share from potential royalties, to asset financing, to working capital. And we got like 50% successful. I don't consider it failure, but some businesses were not able to pay back, but we really learned a lot from that. So we didn't really fail, but we learned what doesn't work within the creative space. And out of that, then we were able to see how to scale the fund. And so all those learnings, we kind of like bundled them up and went to several investors. A lot of doors were closed, obviously, because, everybody was talking about tech. We are kind of like the mad people in the market who are kind of like shouting about creative industries. But a few people actually listened to us, and we were able to scale both our granting models and our commercial facilities out of the very first or the second experiment, and being able to scale that. So I'd say very evidence-based kind of like strategy in terms of like being able to show what the ripple effect and what models come out strongly within the creative sector. And, out of those experiments using the learnings to scale and to go to investors. So that's kind of like how we approached fundraising.
And if I'm looking at just the HEVA Fund, how would you just describe in one sentence how you guys make money?
Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, so we have three different things, and I think I've spoken about them. There is the insights and research. So out of the research and insights, we are able to offer advisory services, either
Okay.
to existing new stakeholders into the sector, or existing stakeholders who are now looking at expanding their work in the creative space. So that's one way. We also manage funds for, I wouldn't say making money for this, because I feel like a lot of it is really centered around impact. And so we will manage funds for institutions like the European Union, and such grants, and then kind of like distribute. So we have a process of how we distribute grants and how we issue grants there to the various creative spaces. And that's kind of like another way in which we're able to continue, let me not say make money, but to continue our work.
Is it on success fees?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a management fee
Okay.
outside, but the management fee primarily goes back to running the fund.
Towards operations.
Yeah, and then thirdly, we do have commercial facilities, so like debt instruments, and there's interest charged on those debt instruments. And we have a revolving fund, so any money that comes back as a repayment goes back to the revolving fund, and we're able to expand our offerings to more businesses. Yeah.
From the revenue share model, what have you learned from exploring potential revenue share models with perhaps artists or businesses? And how does one go about partnering with these, for example, a music artist, and supporting them until they maybe get a contract from a bigger production company or music studio?
Yeah. So I'll speak to how we do it and what our model is. In terms of what we've learned from the revenue shares and, kind of like financing certain sectors. One, IP is a major issue in the continent. And that's kind of like protection, especially of IP, ownership and valuation of IP. And so even when you think about looking at future revenues for an artist or a production company, let's say a music production company, the most logical thing to do would be to look at their assets, right? What they own. In this case, it's obviously intellectual property. The other logical place to go is to look at what is the value of this asset. Like if you have a car, you're able to value it at X amount, and then a bank is able to tell you, okay, we can give you X amount against your car. In this case, the valuation of IP is not really clear. And so you have to kind of like start to do your own valuation processes. So that's one challenge, the valuation of IP. The second thing is the protection of IP, because you'll find there's, artists with like really good, they have a lot of work out there. But then in terms of like what they own themselves as the artists, it's kind of like a very tiny percentage, for example. And so even if they are the ones who produce the IP, they might not necessarily be the ones who have the ownership rights of that IP, which then becomes another challenge. But even in the protection, it's also around the use of IP, how it's distributed, how they're able to get their royalties on a frequent basis. Secondly, looking at event spaces, and, again, the more events there are, the more, you imagine that the more spaces there are for artists to perform. So it's kind of like a win-win. So thinking through like how do we really support the event space to be able to allow for more people to have platforms to perform. And then, so the learnings have been very interesting just around what works and what doesn't, where to invest, where not to invest, and how to go, how to address, I guess, certain investments as well. But I think ultimately, it's been the fact that there's a very clear process where you have to really customize, where you have to really understand the business and the sector and the value chain. And then, out of that understanding of, how it works, who are the key players, where is money made, where is their value, where is value created, etc. Then building models around that kind of that kind of a framework. Yeah.
And on the other side, looking at creatives or businesses in the creative industry, what do you advise them when they're just starting off? Is it acquire as many skills as possible? Of course, bootstrap as long as they can until they essentially build their either personal brand or business brand that they could perhaps then go and apply for funding.
Yeah.
What are you telling these creatives?
I think one of the things we've seen really work for artists is them bringing more people, especially if they're starting to look at it as a business. It's bringing more people into the business, where you find that the artist is great at being an artist, and it's very few times you'll find an artist who's also a business, like who's able to run a business, for example, which is why you'll see a lot of successful artists have like business managers and all these agents, etc. So starting to think through, and even when you're starting, because I know sometimes it's difficult to be able to access those people, it's looking at who can I reach out to just advise maybe on the legal stuff or on the business stuff. Can I have like a fractional accountant or just someone who's able to give me like an extra like another eye on my accounts and how I am making money, and are there any loopholes? And it could even be within your circle of friends. If you have someone who is really good at finance, you just kind of like run things by them. But there are also, I always find it difficult to kind of like start to tell artists to become like you have to become a business person, but they at least have to know the basics of running a business, especially if this is what they want to live off of. You have to at least know what performing for 2 hours should be costed at, so that you're able to pay your rent at the end of the month, and how many of those performances you should have in a month, so that you're also able to pay for your insurance at the end of the month. You have to have those basics, and the basics can either be, you can either learn as you go, which is a difficult process because you'll have made many mistakes, or you can, I guess, kind of like run it by other people to kind of like advise you on how to go about it. And it could even be just someone else who's running a business, trying to understand how do you think about pricing, and then seeing how you can incorporate that into your work. Ultimately, I'd say we've seen, even from our own experience, that majority, and I want to say even 100% of the businesses that make it will always have a team, and they'll always incorporate other people who are able to bring in the different perspectives, the creative business.
Speaking about those success stories there, what did those individuals or businesses do differently? Of course, the one is surrounding yourself with those individuals that can focus on their key things, so you can actually focus on your craft. Essentially having a team around you. But those those success stories, what did they do differently?
That's an interesting question. I think honestly, sometimes it's chance because you'll find also a really good, but okay. So just looking at maybe if I look at our portfolio and looking at the artists we've interacted with and the businesses that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, there's aside from, like you said, surrounding yourself with a team, it's also really understanding what you want out of it. Because there are some people who come into it just saying, I just want to create. I don't care if I make money out of it or not. I just want to create. And I guess, that's fine. But, having that very deep understanding that I want to be able to live off of this, and this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, and having kind of like that conviction that this is the thing you're going to do, is always a good place to start, in terms of like how your business, and I think that's the conviction that then gets you to start thinking around your team, your business model, your how you're going to interact with your audiences, and what kind of jobs you're going to take, what kind of jobs you're not going to take. Like it gives you so much clarity as to what the path is going forward. And I find also that a lot of these businesses as well bring in a kind of like advisory body. And we've seen it, and it doesn't have to be like a very formal one. We've actually seen a music band that has an advisory board. And the advisory board is not even people in the creative space. It's people who've been in business. And I find people are really willing to kind of like help and share their insights, especially, for something that they believe, can work. But there's also something interesting that we've seen, which is a lot of like, it's not a side gig, it's not, I'm doing this on the side. And I know sometimes when you're starting out, you have to kind of like juggle different things. But a lot of the ones that are successful actually have put in, they have skin in the game. They're just like, this is in one way or another, this is going to work. I'm going to figure this out. I'd say in the recent past, we've seen a lot of artists kind of like collaborate, which is really important as well. So collaborations across different value chains, whether it's a musician collaborating with, let's say, a fashion brand, for example. And this is especially when you're looking at local markets and how to tap into different market segments. The collaborations and partnerships are kind of like helping you tap into different audiences that you typically would not be able to reach.
Where do you see the creative industry and the landscape moving towards in the next 5 to 10 years, specifically across the continent?
Oh my gosh, I feel like we're just starting. And I think, so I want to look at it in two ways. I always like to differentiate, because I like to talk about success, not just as being able to tap into, international markets, but also, homegrown, local success. I think we are kind of like at the cusp of, we are kind of like at this cusp, and we are seeing the shift, especially in consumption of content, of, local production, even fashion, across the different sectors. There's kind of like a heightened awareness of kind of, and pride of, being African, whether it's South African, whether it's Kenyan, whether it's Ethiopian. And I think the creative space is really benefiting out of that pride of being African. And so people are now consuming more local products. People are now looking to kind of associate themselves with, something African. I'll give the example of Kenya, where we have this Kenyan bracelet, which initially was just a bracelet that, we call it Masai Market, but used to be like you could easily get those bracelets at Masai Market for something, short of $1 or less. What has happened with this newfound pride of being Kenyan, and Kenyans really kind of like selling their country and talking about and just amplifying, is now the bracelet. First of all, you'll find so many people in Kenya wearing if you want to know someone is a Kenyan, you'll go to other places in the world and you will see someone with a Kenyan bracelet. But now what's happening is that it's not just Kenyans who are wearing the Kenyan bracelet. It's also, so I think in the Olympics, where a lot of these athletes many of them were wearing the Kenyan bracelet, which is interesting because now it stopped being like a cultural good. It's kind of like a fashion statement in some way. And I think there's that trajectory of local products where they're able to, one, capture local audiences. And I guess, as a creative entrepreneur, it's thinking through how do you connect what you're doing to, the local audience? Because I don't feel like, and I don't feel like success really can come out of not tapping into like the local audience first. I always feel like once you crack this audience, then now the international one will kind of like just, come as you go.
Amazing. Wakiuru, thank you. This was super insightful. I've learned so much about the
Thank you.
industry. So yeah, thank
Okay.
you for your time and thank you for sharing your wisdom with me and also the impact that you're making at HEVA Fund, supporting these creatives and just the work that you guys are doing is amazing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really nice meeting you.